Anybody here a big fan of bumper stickers? For the last 30 years or so, I have been commuting back and forth to Lexington during the week, and I've come to the conclusion that when it comes to bumper stickers, there's really just three groups of people to be classified in that. First, there's the not me, not ever, not on my car, thanks but no thanks, you're not putting a bumper sticker anywhere on my vehicle group. That's the group that I belong to. Then you've got what I call the one-and-doners, right? That's the vehicle that's got one single solitary bumper sticker on the back, usually a reference to the intellectual capabilities of their child at some school that they are attending. And then the third group is what I call the more the merrier group, and those are the folks that plaster the whole back end of their vehicle with one message after another. And even though I would never allow a bumper sticker to be put on my own car, I am often entertained by those who do. In fact, I have been guilty a time or two of speeding up and or slowing down in order to be able to read one that I have not seen in the past. Now, the folks that I am most fascinated by are those that they can't stop at one or two. No, they've got like 15 or 20 on the back of their. You don't know what the original paint color was on the back of their vehicle because they've got so many on there. And it makes you wonder, what's going on in here, right? What's happening in their life? What's in their heads? What are they dealing with that they feel the need to tell me all of their views on politics, to make sure that I know their child is on the honor roll at school, and where they stand on every particular world religion, and where they might be in their sexual persuasions, right? Now think about this. Have you ever met anyone in your life who said that their entire worldview was changed because they were suddenly stopped at a red light behind a Ford Fiesta with a whole bunch of bumper stickers that changed everything for them, right? The answer obviously is no. Nobody changes their worldview because of a bumper sticker. The truth of the matter is no one slaps a bumper sticker on their car hoping that it will change your mind. No, they put a bumper sticker on their car to tell you what's on their mind, right? Sometimes, though, I think folks ought to reconsider maybe the messages that they're trying to share, especially when it comes to the religious or the Christian bumper stickers. Let me give you a couple examples. You've probably seen this one before, right? My boss is a Jewish carpenter. Well, actually, he's not. If you've ever read Josh McDowell's book, he is far more than a carpenter, wouldn't you say? How about this one? God is my co-pilot. Like, dude, you're driving an F-150, you're not flying an F-16, right? And you're not a co-pilot or a pilot, you're a farmer, right? And so it's likely that God Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth, isn't your co-anything, right? How about this one? Let go and let God. I'm not really even sure what exactly that means. Let go of what? Let God do what? I mean, I didn't realize that I, as the created, could allow the Creator to do anything. Like He needs my permission to do something? And when you get right down to it, does the idea of let go and let God really help anyone navigate real life? How does let go and let God help a single mom who's just lost her job and she's not sure how she's going to feed her kids? What does let go and let God mean to a father who's trying to parent his kids alone because his wife just ran off with another man? Would you really say, well, just let go and let God to a child who's being abused? Remember in the Old Testament when Job was in the middle of his intense pain, his suffering, his whole world had collapsed all around him. Do you think that his friends who showed up to support him and encourage him would have been okay just if they'd have came and said, well, Job, you know what, you just need to let go. Just let go and let God. Do you think that will have made all the difference for Job in his life at that time? Or maybe when the Apostle Paul was stuck in prison, right? His friends that would come and care for him. Well, Paul, look, you just need to let go. Just let go, let God. Well, today I want to talk to you about a man named Joseph. Not the Joseph that was engaged to Mary and became Jesus' stepfather, but Joseph, the son of Jacob. The man who had the coat of many colors that you learned about in Sunday school all those years ago. Joseph is a fascinating individual. He's got an incredible story, and he has experienced the roller coaster of life's up and downs just like you and I do. His dad was a man named Jacob. Jacob was the notorious con artist. He was the proverbial mama's boy who swindled his father's blessing, stole his brother's birthright. Jacob was the son of Isaac. Isaac, you remember, had two sons. He had Jacob, but he also had Esau, right? And Isaac showed favoritism to one of the two. Remember which one it was? It was Esau, right? Isaac loved Esau more than he loved Jacob. And Jacob, living in that environment, didn't learn a thing from it. And so as Jacob begins to have sons, he then in turn shows favoritism to one of his 12 sons, and that one was Joseph, which is why he had that special coat none of the other brothers had. Well, as you can imagine, in this favoritism environment, there was some very bitter civil rivalry taking place, to the point that his brothers wanted to kill him. They did stop short of first-degree homicide, and they opted instead for a more profitable solution. And so they ended up selling Joseph into slavery to this band of Ishmaelites. Now, if you ever thought that you had a dysfunctional family, I would encourage you sometime and go back through the Old Testament and look. You can start like Genesis 39 at Joseph's life and just work your way back. Go all the way back to Abraham. Follow Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Joseph. You want to talk about a mess? You want to talk about dysfunction? It is there in every possible regard. Now, let me ask you something. If you could press pause on Joseph's story in that moment when his brothers have just exchanged, they gave Joseph to the Ishmaelites gave the brothers a bunch of silver. In that moment, what advice would you give to Joseph as he's being carried off in chains to a foreign land? What would you tell him? Well, Joseph, it's going to be okay. Just let go and let God. You think those words would have calmed his fears? You think they would have empowered him for what lies ahead? Probably not. You see, when our lives get turned upside down and inside out, we need a whole lot more than that, don't we? When your child is in the hospital, or when there is now an empty seat at the dinner table where Dad used to sit, when the doctor says cancer or your boss says layoffs, bumper sticker theology just doesn't cut it. It just won't do. And it's not necessarily because of the brevity of it or even the simplicity of it, as much as it is often the insincerity of it. See, look, Joseph just lost everything. He's lost his family. He's lost his future hopes and dreams. He's lost his security. He's lost his home. Everything he has ever known, it's all gone. It is all gone. He gets taken to Egypt. He gets sold as a piece of property to a man named Potiphar. Just think about this. He's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 years old when this happens. Think about how homesick he must have been. Foreign land, foreign language, foreign food. That would have killed me right there. In a single day, his whole life has spun completely out of control. And yet what we're going to see is that Joseph did not allow the chaos of his circumstances to overcome his emotional well-being. He did not allow that to send him into some kind of a wallowing self-pity every day. No, instead what we find is that Joseph does something. And that's a really important thing for us to learn. Joseph chose to take responsibility in the midst of an incomprehensible situation. And because he did such a good job of taking care of the tasks that had been given to him by his master, he was given even more responsibility until eventually Joseph manages to get promoted all the way up to second in command over the entire estate of Potiphar. He is running the place. In other words, Potiphar took notice of Joseph. There's something about Joseph, and Potiphar noticed it. But Potiphar wasn't the only one. Potiphar's wife also happened to notice. If you have your Bibles, you want to turn to Genesis 36. I'll put it up on the wall as well for us. I'm going to start in verse 6. Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and sleep with me," she demanded. But Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He's held back nothing from me except you, and that's because you're his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept her out of her way as much as possible. I want you to notice how Joseph saw his responsibility clearly here. A responsibility not just to Potiphar, but more importantly to God. He says, how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? You want to know something, folks? You look at this is incredible. This is the kind of thing that it just doesn't happen today. Here's a really young man who could have really given way to bitterness toward God. "God, I can't believe you allowed this to happen. Here we are. I'm supposed to be one of your chosen people, right? And now I'm here. I'm a slave. I'm probably never going to ever be able to get married. And God, you could have prevented all of this, but you didn't. And so I'm going to take what I can get." He didn't do that. He could have easily given way to entitlement. "Well, after all I've been through, God, I deserve this. This is the least that I should have for everything that I've been through." But Joseph realized that regardless of his circumstances, he had a responsibility and he had an obligation to obey God. And he carried that responsibility very well. And so he refuses, even goes out of his way to avoid Potiphar's wife. And so this is the part of the story where God is supposed to reward Joseph for doing the right thing, right? He's doing the right thing. He's doing the moral thing. Doesn't want to sin against God. This is where God is supposed to bless him. This is where God's really supposed to take care of him. This is the part where God's supposed to turn Potiphar's wife into a pillar of salt, right? It's not unprecedented at this point. This is the part where Potiphar's wife is out of the equation and enters stage right, this beautiful queen that will become his wife and they'll live happily ever after. If we're honest, don't we really believe, we may not want to admit it out loud, but if we really search our hearts, don't we really believe that when we do the right thing, only good things are supposed to happen? Don't we kind of really believe that? That if we do the right thing, then God will certainly bless us for that? But is that the way it goes down? Potiphar's wife will not take no for an answer. Day after day, she continues to tempt him until one day she actually gets a hold of him, and Joseph, he knows this is a bad situation. He literally has to tear himself away, and she manages to hang on to his cloak. And remember, he's a slave. It's not like he's got 30 more in the closet. This was probably his only cloak, right? So everybody's, "Where's your cloak, Joseph? Where's your cloak, Joseph?" Right? So now he's torn himself away, and in the process, she rips this garment off of him, and now she's left standing there. She's angry, she's humiliated, and she's got evidence. And so she makes a false accusation against Joseph, accuses him of attempted rape, and Potiphar has him thrown in prison. How about that? Once again, if we're to press pause at this moment in Joseph's life, where everything has one more time been turned completely upside down, what kind of advice would you give Joseph? Remember now, he's in prison for doing the right thing. If he'd have done the wrong thing, he'd still be back at Potiphar's house. He'd be enjoying everything that Potiphar had, including Potiphar's wife. If he would have compromised, all of this could have been avoided. All this pain and suffering. But Joseph did the right thing, and a bad thing still happened. Can anybody here relate to that? I'm sure you can. I'm sure we all can. So let me ask you a question. Does let go and let God help us in a moment like that? And if we're honest, I don't think it does. And some of you probably know this all too well. Maybe you practiced financial integrity all your life and still ended up in bankruptcy. Maybe you were completely faithful to your spouse and still ended up in divorce court. Maybe you taught your children about Jesus from the time they were old enough to walk and they still rebelled. It is during those dark moments when we feel like we're in a prison cell, when words like infertility and cancer and there's been a car accident, when those words are used and directed toward us, we need more than a God who's sitting up there in heaven hoping that we'll just let go and let Him. We need a God who is in control. We need a God who is, and here's our big word for this series as we bring it to an end today, we need a God who is sovereign. That's our big word for our big God. The word sovereign means in control. We need a God who is in control when everything around us is out of control. We need a God that we can trust. We need a God that we can hold on to when it seems like there's nothing but chaos all around us. Now, if you were to go back and study Joseph's life, and I would really encourage you to do that sometime, there's a little phrase that pops up here and there throughout his story. We see it in verse 2 when Joseph gets taken to Potiphar's house. We see it again in verse 21 when he's taken off to prison. And here's what it says. Verse 21, "But the Lord was with Joseph." But the Lord was with Joseph. And it is clear from Joseph's life that he really believed that. He truly believed that. And so instead of Joseph letting go, Joseph actually holds on. His entire life is a demonstration of holding on to two things. He holds on to God's sovereignty, and he holds on to his responsibility. Let me say that again. He holds on to God's sovereignty, and he holds on to his responsibility. Now, here's what it means to say that God is sovereign. It means that He's king. He is king of everything. He's in charge of it all. He's the supreme ruler of the universe. You may remember back when the election was going on, I don't know if you saw any signs like this. I saw a few sprinkled around, and I saw that, and when I saw it, I kind of chuckled at it, and I thought, yeah, I get it. I mean, I understand the sentiment of that. I understand the intent of what the sign was really getting to, but we need to be very clear about something. We need to make sure that we understand this very thoroughly. Jesus isn't running for any office, okay? He's not running for anything. He's not campaigning for anything. He's not trying to secure your vote. He's not trying to woo you into electing Him to some office. And here's why. Because you don't vote for a king. And Jesus is the king. You know, we have a hard time in the United States understanding the concept of a king because we have built and structured our nation in such a way so that there never will be one, right? We don't want a king in the United States. And so we've kind of lost that over the last several hundred years, understanding the concept of a king. But when it comes to the kingdom of God, we understand there's no voting. In any kingdom, the king never got voted in. There is simply a decision. You and I get to decide whether we are going to submit to the king or whether we are going to rebel against the king. And guess what? The king gets to determine the outcome based on the decision that you make, not you. The king is the one who determines the outcome. And what you decide for him or against him does not change the fact that he still sits on the throne and he is sovereign king of everything. So Joseph, he held on to God's sovereignty. But that's not all. He also held on to his own responsibility. Even in that prison, Joseph was faithful. Joseph obeyed God. He did what he could do with the responsibilities that he had been given. And then guess what? the same thing happened in prison that happened at Potiphar's house. He was continually given more and more and more responsibility. He was promoted to the point where not only was he just in charge of his little cell, he was in charge of the whole entire prison. So what we see in Joseph's life is that he did not live every day like Eeyore. Remember Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh? Well, here we are again. Another day and I'm in prison and woe is me. Right? You remember Eeyore? That's not the way Joseph lived. Joseph continually lived out a very simple principle that Charles Stanley brilliantly summed it up like this. He says, obey God and leave the consequences to Him. I love that. Super simple. Obey God and leave the consequences to Him. Now listen, I know that there have been millions of pages that have been written. There has been thousands of gallons of ink spilled on trying to explain, on trying to reconcile this tension that exists between God's sovereignty and human responsibility. And there are a whole lot of folks who have more smarts in their little finger than I have in my entire body. So I'm not going to stand up here and pretend to you like I've got it all figured out. But what I do want to do is suggest for us a very practical way based on Joseph's example of living well, even when our situation and our circumstances suggest otherwise. So let me try to illustrate it like this. So, if I grab a hold of God's sovereignty, right? And I hold on to this. And I just take this attitude that says, you know, God is sovereign and God's going to make the decisions and everything's going to work out the way that God wants it to work out and it's all up to Him. And so I'm just going to sit back. I'm not going to do anything because no matter what I do, it doesn't matter. God's sovereign. God's going to do what God wants to do. And if that's the attitude that I take and I just hold on to that and I pull on that and I put my whole life on that and I start to put my weight on that, it's not going to take very long and I'm going to be laying flat on my back on the floor, right? Because it's not going to hold me up. That will not hold me up. And the thing is, other people around you, they're going to get hurt as well. Because you've got this come what may, God's going to do what God's going to do kind of attitude. And since He's sovereign, He's going to sit on the throne, then I just don't have to worry about my responsibility. And if that's the kind of attitude that we take, it's really just a cop-out. On the flip side, if I grab a hold of my responsibility, and I hang on to my responsibility, like, you know what? I'm the master of my universe, right? I'm the captain of my soul. And that's what I hold on to. And I start putting my weight on that, it won't be but a minute, and I'll be flat on the floor again in a bad, bad way. Me trying to be in charge of me and trying to be in charge of you and anybody else in the universe, that's not good for any of us, right? When we rely on our responsibility, we end up in a very scary place and we start to scramble. We lose sight of God's sovereignty. And when we lose sight of God's sovereignty, then we start to believe that everything depends on things like, well, who's sleeping in the White House now? We become paralyzed by pandemics. We get intoxicated by politics. We get ruled by social media. We ride the waves of our own emotions and we demonize anyone and everyone else who dares to disagree with us. And here's why. Because when you get right down to it, we're just scared. We're just plain scared. We're afraid. Well, what if there's no God? Well, what if there is a God, but He's not really in control? Or, well, what if there's a God and He's in control, but He just doesn't really care? Well, then that means that it's all up to me. And I know that's way above my pay grade. And deep down, I don't know what to do. And so I am scared. May I suggest to you today that the best way for us to live is not to let go and let God. The best way for us to live is to hold on tight to two things: to God's sovereignty and our responsibility. And when I hold on to both of these, I can put my weight behind that. I can get behind that. That will hold me up. Hold tight to both of those things. God is king of everything, and we have responsibilities. That's what Joseph did. And because of that, he not only survived his circumstances, he actually thrived in the midst of them. Eventually, about a decade later, he finally got out of prison. Yet another promotion, only this time was not to a man's estate, wasn't even to a government institution. This time he gets promoted to over the entire nation of Egypt. He is second in charge only to Pharaoh himself. He gets put in charge of this massive food preparation project. You see, God had revealed that there was going to be a famine, a bad famine. They needed to prepare for that famine. And when the famine strikes, it is so severe that it affects people all over the world. Everyone over the land is hit hard, and that includes Joseph's family, who we've not heard about for a while, back in their homeland. Well, Joseph's dad, Jacob, he hears that there's food in Egypt. And so he sends his sons to Egypt to get food. Hey, go buy some grain, bring it back, otherwise we're all going to starve to death. And in what some would call a twist of fate, but I would actually call the sovereign hand of God, here these brothers find themselves asking for grace and mercy from the very one that they had sold into slavery for a few pieces of silver all those years before. And if you and I were writing the story, this is where we'd have Joseph get his pound of flesh, right? This is where you get to the part where it's payback time. This is where Joseph would get his revenge for all the wrongful suffering that he'd endured. But Joseph doesn't give these brothers what they deserve. He gave them what they needed. He provided for them. He protected them. He even had them go back and get mom and dad and all the family and move them to Egypt so that he could save them. Joseph saved the very ones who sold him out. Does that sound familiar? The story goes on. You got to skip ahead to Genesis chapter 50. Joseph has saved them. They're living, they're prospering in the land of Egypt. And then Jacob dies. When Jacob dies, the brothers are like, uh-oh. We were safe while Dad was alive. Let's see what happens. But now that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers became fearful. Now Joseph will show his anger, pay us back for all the wrong we did to him, they said. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before your father died, he instructed us to say to you, please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for their sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of God, of your father, beg you to forgive our sin. When Joseph received the message, he broke down and wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before Joseph. Look, we are your slaves, they said. But Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children. So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. Now I want you to notice those two words up there in verse 20. Two words upon which our very existence hangs. But God. Two words over the last several months I have found myself clinging to. I've found myself dwelling on. I've found myself thinking about. Maybe someday we'll even get worked up into a sermon series, I hope. But Joseph says to his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God. But God. Make no mistake about it. What Joseph's brothers did to him was wrong. What was done to you when you were a child was wrong. What Potiphar's wife did to Joseph was evil. What happened to you in college was evil. When Joseph found himself seemingly rotting away in prison wondering, has God forgotten about me? God had not forgotten about him. And God has not forgotten about you either. Just hold on. See, the reality is people do evil horrible, terrible, dark, sinful things. But God is in control. And God is good. We have a good God in control. Now, most people don't have a difficulty grasping the idea that God does not cause evil. I think we all agree with that, right? That God does not cause evil. That's not what keeps us awake at night. What keeps us awake at night is, why does God allow it? Why doesn't He intervene? It is the lack of intervention that bothers us more than anything else. A.W. Tozer said this: anything God has ever done, He can do now. Anything God has done anywhere, He can do here. Anything God has ever done for anyone, He can do for you. Oh yeah? Well, then why doesn't He? That's what we want to know, right? Why doesn't He? Why didn't He? Why won't He? Those are the questions that we ask in our darkest hours. If God could have stopped Joseph from being thrown in the well, if God could have stopped Joseph from being falsely accused, if He could have stopped Joseph from being left to rot in a prison cell, well then why didn't He? If God could cure your cancer, if He could save your marriage, if He could bring your child home, why doesn't He? Why doesn't God do something? That's what we want to know. And I'm here to stand right here today and tell you, God did something. He absolutely did something. A long time ago, on a hill called Calvary, God allowed His Son on a very dark day to suffer and die a humiliating, dreadful death. God intervened in human suffering, and He used that moment to accomplish amazing grace, where all of our sin, all of our shame, all of our guilt was paid for on that cross. What those men did to Jesus on that day, it was sinful, it was evil, it was brutal, but God used that for good. And it doesn't stop there. See, not only did God do something at the cross, God is still doing something right now through His church. The moment the church was born, the enemy attacked. Persecution began. Evil came against the church, and the church was scattered to the four corners of the earth in seeming defeat. But God did something. God used that to spread the good news of the gospel all across the world. So all around the world, the church exists today so that lost people can be found, so that vulnerable people, fatherless people can find a home, can find a family, so that the broken can be made whole. Not only has God done something at the cross, not only is God doing something through His church, God is also going to do something when the King returns. When King Jesus comes back, God is going to do something. Our sovereign King is coming. He is coming back for you. He is coming back for me. And when He comes, He will right every wrong. He will remedy all human suffering. It will be gone. We get a beautiful picture of this in Revelation chapter 21. I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, "Look, God's home is now among His people. He will live with them and they will be His people. God Himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things are gone forever." And the one sitting on the throne said, "Look, I'm making everything new." And then He said to me, "Write this down, for what I tell you is trustworthy and true." And He also said, "It is finished. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To all who are thirsty, I will give freely from the springs of the water of life. All who are victorious will inherit all of these blessings, and I will be their God, and they will be my children." And so, friends, until that day, you and I need to wake up every single day and grab a hold of God's sovereignty and our responsibility. Grab a hold of both of those things and hang on to them with all you've got. Because that day is coming. That day is coming. And it may be sooner than we think. I want to close with this. Story of a woman named Louisa Stead. Louisa was born in England over 100 years ago. But she actually ended up growing up just north of here in Cincinnati, Ohio. At a very early age, she committed her life to Christ and to serving on a foreign mission field. She got married also very young and had a child soon thereafter. When the child was 4 years old, her and the child and her husband, they took a vacation to the beach. And as they were out there enjoying the sun and the sand, they heard somebody from the ocean screaming for help. So her husband ran out into the ocean to save this person who was drowning. Well, as you can imagine, as happens more times than we'd like, both the father and the person he was trying to save ended up drowning right in front of Louisa and her daughter. As you can imagine, everything in her life now came into question. Yet in her suffering and in her grief, she wrote a song, which happens often. She stayed true to her commitment to serve on the mission field, and she actually ended up over in Africa. And the song that she wrote in the wake of her suffering, she took with her as she went to Africa. It's a song that is still sung today in pockets all over the continent. In fact, it's still sung all over the world. And it's a song I'd like for all of us to stand up right now and sing together as we bring our series, Big God, Big Words, to a close. And I just want to encourage you to remember, do not forget, God is sovereign. God is in control, and we can trust Him. Hold on to the sovereignty of God. And hold on to our responsibility, the responsibility to trust Him. Let's all stand. Let's all sing together. 'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus.
Trust